Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. The state of Utah, the winter of '87 or '88, was a relatively mild one. The Wasatch Mountains still got their usual dusting of snow, but for us lowlanders, I remember there being a lot less snow that winter. We got some snow here in Marion around the holidays, which was nice, because it wouldn't have felt quite the same without it. But other than that, it was one of the mildest I can remember. I was a deputy in the sheriff's office at the time, so we all welcomed the less hazardous driving conditions, and I remember thinking that we might have just gotten off easy that winter. But boy, was I wrong about that. The first sign of trouble came in January when early on the morning of the 16th, a bomb ripped through Marion's LDS Mormon chapel and caused over $1 million in damages. Since the bomb was rigged to explode at 3 a.m., no one was around when it went off. But it shocked everyone in town. Only about 600 people live there, by the way, because who the hell would want to blow up a church like that? Well, it wasn't long before detectives started to form a pretty solid picture of who was to blame, and strangely, it involved a man who had been dead for the last 9 years. And to tell the story of why the Mormon chapel got blown up, you gotta tell the story of a guy named John Singer. He was born in New York City, but since his parents were from Dresden, they returned to World War II Germany when he was still a baby so his dad could join the SS. Singer himself was said to have been in the Hitler Youth when he was a kid, and then after the war, his mom divorced his dad and she brought little Johnny back to the States to be raised as Mormon. They moved to Utah. He got married in his late 20s, then he and his wife ended up settling on a farm in Marion. He was an active member of the church until the early 70s when he was suddenly excommunicated, but the church never explained exactly why they'd had him removed, and neither did Singer. A few years later he's openly practicing polygamy, removing his kids from the public school system, then saying a bunch of racist crap to reporters when they went to ask him why. And as you can imagine, this makes him a national hate figure, and when his wife decides that she wants to leave him, he decides he's going to hold his kids hostage. And the cops show up, a standoff begins, and then when Singer points a gun at one of them, a sniper watching from a nearby roof decided to compromise Singer to a more permanent degree, as they say. Singer was dead, but he wasn't some lone kook. He was an influential man in certain more extreme Mormon circles, and when that police sniper shot him down, his followers were pissed. And none more so than a guy named Adam Swap. Swap was 17 when he first heard about John Singer's fight against the feds, and it made him a huge fan. And a few months after he turned 18, Swap decided that he wanted to meet Singer. But his idol was killed before he had the chance. He ended up hanging around the Singer family until he was introduced to John's daughter, Heidi, who he married not long after. But only after gaining the approval of Heidi's mom, Vicky, who he got very close with over the years. The whole family ended up moving into some isolated off-the-grid compound out near Hurricane, where they lived as something of a local curiosity. But then, in early '88, some real strange stuff started happening down there near the Virgin River. The story goes that in early January, Adam Swap approached Vicky Singer, who was still very much the head of the family, and told her God had been talking to him. He said he'd been instructed to place a spear with 9 feathers tied to it, representing the 9 years since Singer's death, into the ground near the LDS church. Then, if he blew it up, the act would actually resurrect the late John Singer. Since the bomb went off on the 9th anniversary of John's shooting and supposedly at a similar time too, law enforcement was quick to suspect that the occupants of the Singer Swap compound were to blame. Vicky Singer's son-in-law was then sent into the compound, basically to ask if they had any involvement, and when he returned, he had bad news. Not only did Swap and Singer admit to planting the bomb, but they had no intention of surrendering peacefully. And that is where we came in. When we arrived at the Singer compound, we knew that we were facing something big. The property was a collection of trailers and makeshift buildings. Surrounded on all sides by snow-covered fields, meaning we had to keep our distance and stay behind our vehicles to keep ourselves from being exposed. Word was that the singers were heavily armed and that they hated anyone with a badge and a gun, so we were very careful not to put ourselves in the firing line. We weren't deputies to them. We were the hand of the oppressor, and they called us modern-day Pharisees, pretenders, and tyrants, agents of a corrupt system they'd long since rejected. We knew Swap had told followers to never surrender, and based on the info we'd gotten, we figured that they were fanatical enough to die trying to defend him. Our first goal was to establish a line of communication with the folks in the compound. Negotiators were brought in to try to de-escalate the situation, and over the next few days we used every tool at our disposal to talk with them. We gave them a cell phone. Nothing like you got today, but it worked for a while, until it didn't. We don't know if it ran out of battery, or someone got mad, broke it, and then lied about breaking it, but we were forced to use bullhorns and even handwritten, hand-delivered messages at one point. And because no one had died in the LDS chapel bombing, no one was looking at any serious jail time for just blowing up a building. So to us, that meant someone would eventually see sense, come out with their hands up, and not risk getting shot when a good enough attorney could whittle down their sentence to just maybe 2 or 3 years. We were apprehensive but optimistic, and that all changed when we started talking to them. Like I said, they were fanatical, and every communication the negotiators got was filled with all this grand religious talk. They said that they were carrying out God's will, that the US government was on its knees, and that when John Singer rose from his grave, it would signal the coming rapture. In reply, the negotiators asked them to consider the safety of their children, but that only prompted more of that crazy tinfoil hat talk about the end of days, and that was truly scary. Because if they were willing to use their own kids as human shields, what else were they prepared to do? The standoff stretched on, each day colder and more tense than the last. Surveillance showed little movement outside of the compound, though we occasionally saw children's faces pressed against the frosted windows. And at some points, the snow was relentless, and the temperatures dropped way below freezing come nightfall. We took shifts, a mix of local deputies and state cops all huddling behind vehicles and makeshift barricades, divided by agency, but united in our attempts to keep from freezing our asses off. And at times the compound was eerily quiet, and every shadow in a window or rustle in the snow put us on edge. And like I said earlier, the singers were heavily armed, and at the time, we had no idea how many folks were actually in there, so our biggest fear was them rushing us during the night, having some wannabe snipers start taking potshots at us. We still had hope, but by day 4, that hope was starting to dwindle. Day 4 was when they called the negotiators back and cut off the power to the compound. It didn't do much at first, because they had all kinds of generators and supplies stockpiled for an event such as that one, but it meant a shift from a negotiation mentality to a siege mentality. It also meant that it was only a matter of time before the singers were forced to do something, be that surrender or come out fighting. Word of the standoff spread quickly, and soon the area was swarming with reporters. Helicopters buzzed overhead and TV trucks lined the nearby roads. Everyone wanted to ask us questions whenever we walked past the tape, and we'd been instructed not to say anything to anybody. Whenever I caught the news when I was off duty, it was crazy to see how divided the public was over the issue. Some saw the singers as extremists and criminals, while others saw them as victims of government overreach. It added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. The eyes of the nation were on us, and any misstep could turn the standoff into a goddamn bloodbath which, as you can imagine, was hell on our nerves. Negotiations continued on and off for more than a week, and by the 10th day, we were exhausted. Nights were sleepless, and the tension weighed heavy on all of us. Then, on January 28th, after nearly 2 weeks of watching and waiting, the situation came to a head. Adam Swap finally agreed to a surrender, but apparently his fanatical followers didn't get the message. When officers moved in to take him into custody, some of them opened fire. Shots were fired from inside the compound, and in the gunfight that followed, Lieutenant House, a veteran officer and close personal friend to many of us, was wounded and killed. The loss hit us like a punch to the gut. Swap was eventually subdued and arrested along with Vicky Singer and others. The children were removed from the compound. They were terrified but thankfully unharmed. The standoff was over, but it cost us dearly. Looking back, it felt more like a clash between law enforcement and a rogue group of survivalists. The Singers wanted to live off the grid, free from what they saw as government interference, but their actions, bombing a church and killing an officer, brought them squarely into the spotlight. They could have lived the life they wanted, but they chose not to. And when they kicked out at the world kicked back. And for me, that's what it's all about. Bad choices leading to bad outcomes. Not just for the person making them, but for the people around them. The ones who'd never have been dragged into things otherwise. The children huddled inside that compound didn't choose that life, and Fred House didn't deserve to die like that, neither. Yet here we are, running around in the bitter cold of a Utah winter all because some dumbass lost his goddamned mind. I'll never forget the faces, the tension, and the weight of the decisions we had to make, and as much as I'd like to leave that standoff behind, I know that it'll stay with me till the day that I meet my own maker. During the spring of 1987, I had myself a job working in the forests of Northern California. Real middle of nowhere, off-the-grid kind of place where we stayed on-site instead of driving home every night. I'd been working as a sawmill operator for a few years by then, proud to be providing for my family and proud to be doing my part in an industry that kept the local economy alive. The days were long, the air smelled of fresh pine and sawdust, and when we were done, we'd sink some cold ones, hit the hay, and do it all again the next day. But then came one morning when everything changed, not just for me, but for everyone who worked in those woods. I showed up at the mill at dawn, just as the morning sun was beginning to peek over the hills. The air was cool, the mill was quiet, and I drank a cup of coffee with my coworkers before heading out to my head rig. My machine, a head rig, was a massive saw designed to cut through logs like butter, and I knew that thing inside and out. I checked everything over as I always did, making sure the blades were sharp and the mechanisms were running smoothly. Then, when the first log started to roll in, it was business as usual. My job required a lot of focus, a heavy amount of precision, and a healthy respect for the power of large machinery. It wasn't uncommon for a piece of wood to jump or splinter if something was off. But generally speaking, we knew the risks and trusted our equipment. The log looked ordinary, a straight Douglas fir, no different from the hundreds of others I'd cut that month. But as I fed it into the saw, something happened that will be with me for as long as I live. There was a deafening sound, a metallic screech that set my teeth on edge, and before I knew what was happening, the saw blade exploded. Shards of metal went flying, and the force of the impact knocked me off my feet. It felt like an earthquake had hit the mill. I didn't realize I was injured at first. Adrenaline has a way of masking the pain, but when I looked down, I saw the blood. My face, arms, and chest were covered in it. The jagged pieces of the saw blade had torn into me like shrapnel. My right hand, the hand I'd used to guide those logs every day, was mangled beyond recognition. I felt a sharp burning pain in my eye and then realized I couldn't see out of it. After the bang, the mill erupted into shouts and yells. My coworkers tried to help, but their voices sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. Someone called for an air ambulance while another coworker tried to stop the bleeding. I remember staring at the log, now split open, to reveal a gleaming metal spike embedded deep within the wood. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately put that spike there, to try and kill me. The hospital stay was a blur of surgeries and bandages, and I'd later learned that my right hand couldn't be saved and the damage to my eye was permanent. But the physical injuries were only part of the story. The mental scars were just as bad. I trusted that my workplace was safe, that the only dangers were the ones we were trained to handle. But this was something altogether different. This was sabotage. For those unfamiliar with the practice, tree spiking is a tactic used by radical environmental groups to try and prevent logging. By driving long metal spikes into trees, they create a huge danger to loggers, Because if a saw blade comes into contact with one of those spikes, it can explode. As we've already covered here, the consequences aren't just mechanical, they're very human. That spike could have killed me. It could have killed someone else. And that doesn't win me over to their cause, not one bit. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of pain and confusion, but primarily, anger. The media got a hold of the story, and reporters swarmed the mill, eager to paint me as a victim of an environmental war. I wasn't interested in their narratives, I just wanted to understand why someone would risk my life to make a statement. And did they even once stop to think about the consequences? My coworkers were badly shaken by what happened to me, and the incident cast a heavy shadow over the entire mill. Every log that came in was inspected with more scrutiny than ever before, and I heard everyone was jumpy for a long time afterward. The company installed metal detectors at great expense, but that didn't do much for people's peace of mind. It wasn't even just fear, it was anger. Hatred, even. They wanted to hang whoever spiked that tree. Recovery was a long road. I had to learn how to navigate the world with one hand, how to adjust to the loss of vision in one eye. My wife and kids were my rock, but I'd be lying if I said it was easy. I struggled with depression, with the weight of feeling targeted, even if I wasn't personally the reason for the spike. It was a weird feeling, and it took a long time before I could even think about putting it behind me. In the years since, I've thought a lot about the people who spiked that tree. I've wondered if they ever thought about me and about the damage they caused to my life. I understand their anger at the logging industry. I've seen firsthand the impact of clear-cutting on the environment. But there has to be a better way to make a point than putting lives at risk. Protest should bring actual change, not harm innocent people and turn them off the cause. Today, I'm no longer in the logging industry. I've moved on to other work, something much safer. The office isn't nearly as exciting or satisfying as working in the forests of NorCal. But every now and then, whenever I hear the hum of machinery, I feel like I'm transported all the way back to that day in May 1987. It still makes me angry sometimes, because no cause, no matter how righteous, is worth the cost of a single human life. What feels like many, many years ago, I was enjoying a short vacation in my family's cabin up in Maine. The cabin was tucked away on the edge of North Pond, and while it was only a few rooms, it was very homely, with no neighbors for miles in all directions. My parents would take me and my sisters back when I was just a little boy, and although I didn't much enjoy it at the time, it was a place that I gravitated back toward later on in life. At first, I'd drive up there just to clear my head, but after a while, I started heading out on solo hikes and reliving some of those childhood vacations. So, I was up at the cabin, I'd been hiking all day, and after dinner, I was just about ready to sleep. It had been a quiet night, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as they settled into the cool Maine air, and I'd fallen asleep early, but then, around midnight, I woke up startled. My senses prickled with the unmistakable feeling that something was very wrong. At first, I thought it might have just been the wind blowing through the trees outside. But what I heard next didn't quite match the rhythm of the swaying trees. I listened harder, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears as the noise shifted into something more distinct, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Someone was inside the cabin with me. I remember just freezing, lying totally motionless in the bed while I listened and tried to figure out what to do. The thought of another person inside sent a chill down my spine, and I knew I had to do something. I slowly slipped out of bed, careful to keep the mattress from squeaking. After putting on my pants and boots, I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table. I remember seeing my own hand shaking as I went to grab it. Clicking it on felt like too great a risk, so I kept it off, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. I'd use it if I really needed to, but until then, I needed to not be seen. The sound of rummaging came from the kitchen, pots clinking together softly, drawers opening and closing, and whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. But they also didn't sound like they were afraid of being caught either. My car was outside, so it's not like they could have made a mistake and assumed the place was empty. In which case, were they crazy? Was I safe? What were they looking for? My pulse pounded in my ears as I crept down the hall, each step louder in my head than the last as it seemed to go on forever. When I reached the corner where the hall opened into the kitchen, I paused and took a deep breath. I then leaned forward just enough to peek around the edge of the wall. And then I saw him. A man stood in the dark kitchen, his back to me. He moved quickly but carefully, inspecting the contents of my cabinets and setting aside items he probably deemed worthy of taking. It was dark, but there was enough moonlight coming through the window for me to see that he wore layers of tattered clothes, and that his hair was unkempt and his beard was wild. He was also very skinny, like he was sick or hadn't eaten much, and his movements were eerily calm for someone shifting through a stranger's home. I wanted to say something, to demand that he leave, but the words just got caught in my throat. There was something about him, this overwhelming sense that he wasn't normal, that made him feel less like a person and more like, I don't know, a creature. If there's a black bear eating chicken bones out of your trash, you can't just ask it to leave. And if you approach it, it might just eat your damn face off. And that's exactly what it felt like, looking at this guy in my kitchen. I tightened my grip around the heavy flashlight until my knuckles ached from the force. I'm not even joking, and I told myself, if he comes for me when I yell at him, I'm gonna hit him with this. I was just in the process of coming up with something very scary to yell when he turned. And for a brief, terrifying moment, we made eye contact. His eyes were piercing, but he didn't seem angry or scared. He just looked tired, like he didn't have a single F left to give. He didn't speak. He didn't try to attack me. He didn't even seem startled to see me standing there. Instead, he just looked at me in a way I found completely unreadable, and I froze again. My heart was absolutely hammering against my ribs by then, and I braced myself for him to do something. Anything aggressive or threatening. But he didn't. He just turned back to his task and selected a few more items, stuff like a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a half-eaten pack of crackers. And when he was finished, he scooped everything into a bag that he had with him and walked toward the back door of the cabin, which, I guess, was how he'd gotten in the first place. He opened the door and slipped silently into the night, disappearing into the dark as if I'd never even seen him in the first place. I stood there for what felt like hours, the flashlight feeling heavy in my hand as my breathing and heart rate returned to normal. The house was creepily still, and the only evidence that he'd even been there was the disarray in my kitchen, and the open door swinging gently in the breeze. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent securing the cabin and wondering if he'd return, I learned his name. Or rather, the name he'd been given by the locals, the North Pond Hermit. I only found out later that his real name was Christopher Thomas Knight, and for nearly 3 decades, he'd lived in the woods around North Pond, surviving off what he could scavenge and steal. He disappeared into the Maine wilderness in the mid-80s sometime. He turned his back on society entirely, I guess, but no one really ever knew why. Some people talked about him trying to escape something, like a traumatic event or something of that nature. Others believed he just wanted to be left alone, to live out his days in peace, away from a society he never understood, and that never really understood him either. Over the years, he became something of a local legend. He'd slip into cabins and campsites, taking only what he needed, food, clothing, tools, and stuff, but he never caused harm and never left a trace beyond what he'd taken. People spoke of him with a mix of fear and fascination, unable to figure him out, but somehow understanding of him. And he kept on living that life of raiding cabins and homes until he finally got caught sometime in 2013. I heard he told the cops that he'd managed to survive 27 years without lighting a single fire, and did all his cooking on stolen propane tanks. His arrest made headlines and everyone was talking about him, but all I could think when I saw his picture was, holy crap. It's you. When I think back to that night, I'm haunted not by what he did, but by what he looked like. I saw what I think was a great emptiness in his eyes, like all the humanity had been drained out of him. But at the same time, he wasn't there to hurt me. He was simply trying to survive. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I've heard the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of a cabinet door. I'll get up, check the locks, and peer out into the night, wondering if he's still out there, moving silently through the trees, like a ghost in the darkness. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.